So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. Hi there. My name is Edward. I am president of Chicago Ornithological Society, and welcome to Birds and Bytes, our virtual program series where we feature all kinds of expert speakers on a variety of different topics across the birding spectrum. And today's a very special episode, not just because we have the eminent John Bates with us here today, but this is episode 25 of Birds and Bytes. Pew! Yay! Fireworks! I'm very excited about all the amazing programs that we've had here today, and I don't think this is going to be any different in terms of just how awesome it is to get you guys together in the virtual space, learn about birds, share our joy, our November bird desires, things like that, in a manner that allows us to all be in the same room, even if we can't sometimes. So once again, hurrah for 25 episodes. Most of those episodes are recorded. If you go to our YouTube channel, you can see them and view them at any time. And this one will be no different. Once we finish up here, this will be viewable at any time once I get it all uploaded to the internet. But anyway, so huzzah. Moving on to the topic of the day here today, though. So a couple of quick reminders. Yes, we will be recording. Please keep yourself muted so as to not make weird, awkward sounds in the background while the presentation is going. And then additionally, we're going to save your questions for the end. So now if there's questions that come up or just pop in your brain as you go, feel free to slap them in the chat. We can either have John, depending on what works best for you, can either answer them as we go, or we can answer them at the end of the program. But one way or the other, we will be calling on you guys to get those questions. We want to hear from you, but go ahead and save those inquiries for the end or put them in the chat. Today we have John Bates, Dr. Bates from the Field Museum of Natural History here to talk to us about one of his more recent projects that he's been working on, and we're very excited to bring him back for the second time to the Birds and Bytes stage here. And so I think without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over. Y'all didn't come here to listen to me yammer, and I will pass it along to John here. So John, take it away. Round of virtual applause for John.
Well, thanks, Edward. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen here and get right to it. So what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is a trip that was probably being planned in about 2019. And it was a trip to Antarctica via the Falkland Islands and South Georgia. This is the Field Museum's logo, and I have this job as curator of birds at the Field Museum where I get to go to lots of different places. I've spent a lot of times in South America and various parts of North America and Africa. And this is our slogan, Earth, We're on It. But here down at the bottom is the group that funded this, which is the Robert Pritzker Center for Meteoritics and Polar Studies. And where I'm going to take you to is if you turn the world on its and look at it from the bottom, you get a very different picture of an area basically full of ice and snow and rock and water. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing, too, is the time of year. So I went on this trip in January of this year. We had to postpone it a year because of COVID. And of course, in Evanston, at that point in time, which is where I live, there's my wife shoveling snow from the steps of our house. And there's a picture from the plane of looking over Wisconsin, which is full of snow. You're going down to the austral winter. And so this was an incredible trip, which of course was completely in jeopardy the entire time we were planning it as the result of COVID. So the year before was when we were actually scheduled to go. So January 2021. And that clearly wasn't possible to have happen. And so we did pull it off, though, in January of 2022. And there's a whole group of people that went on this trip that I'll talk about. But one of the persons there right in the front for the birders from the Chicago region, you might know, is Jacob Cooper, one of my former graduate students who's now down at the University of Kansas and the Haskell Indian University. And then Sushma Reddy, who's curator of birds up at the University of Minnesota. And we had to get all these COVID tests and make sure everything was okay. And we were then able to get on planes and fly to the UK. And in the UK, we trucked out to a military base called Bryce Norton out in the 2 hours outside of London. And that's the only way you could get to the Falkland Islands for this trip. And here's our entire group assembled in the Falklands, getting ready to, or at Bryce Norton in the UK, getting ready to go to the Falklands. And this is where we were headed. So this is Stanley in the Falklands, and we got off the plane and went straight to this boat. And part of the reason that we did this was because we were able to actually do the trip because we told the Falklands government we thought we could quarantine on the boat for 10 days while we went to the Antarctic Peninsula. And so that's exactly what we did. We got on this boat, which is called the Vincent of Antarctica. And it's a sailboat. It's a 77-foot long sailboat. And it was the brainchild of this guy named Skip Novak, who's shown here. And Skip is a legendary Arctic and Antarctic sailor who happens to be from Chicago, and he runs a group called Pelagic Expeditions, and they run the Vincent of Antarctica, and it's a spectacular ship. And there were 12 of us, 3 crew members, and 9 researchers that headed out from Stanley. Right around the 28th or 29th of December of 2021. And as we were leaving Stanley Harbor, the only other boat there was a little sailboat that was run by this guy. And you can see he actually has a rack of lamb on the back of his boat. And so that's why I took the picture, but he'll come back into this story at the end or in the middle of this talk. But the crew was incredible. So these 3 crew members are very experienced sailors. They also happen to be incredible cooks. They one of them had written a cookbook, Kenneth Perdigon, the first mate. And I've been in the field in a lot of places, and I have to be honest with you, I don't think I've ever eaten as well as I did on this ship during our trip. And so there's a trip report on eBird. If you're interested, you can go look at more stuff that I'm going to talk about. But thanks to Jacob and a guy named Bryce Robinson, who's a graduate student at Cornell University, we made an awful lot of eBird lists as we were going along. And this little triangle, which is the upper left corner, is the Falkland Islands. And then we went south to the Antarctic Peninsula and then crossed the Drake Passage again to get to South Georgia before coming back to the Falkland Islands is about 3,000 miles worth of sailing. And the distances are about the same as going from Chicago down to New Orleans, over to Denver, and then back to Chicago. So it's a long trip, and we were at sea for about a month. And if you can see this, one of the things that's interesting about this is we're essentially going into this area, and everybody seems to know about Shackleton's trip. And actually, not long after we were there, they announced that they found the Endurance, the boat that was crushed in the ice, and led them to end up on Elephant Island and then sail across the Drake Passage to South Georgia. And at some level, we were actually recreating that step in a very fancy sailboat. So the minute you get out on the open ocean, these southern oceans, you start seeing a group of birds that I was just completely excited about, such as giant petrels. This is a southern giant petrel. They come in a couple different plumage morphs, and you'll see them again later in the talk because they do a lot of different things. These birds are actually out on the open ocean, and they're one of the first things you see as you're leaving the harbors. And of course, as you get out in the ocean, there are other seabirds that you're hoping to see. And this is one of these Pterodroma petrels. This is soft plumage petrel, a middle-sized petrel that was quite common across the passage. And then this might be the most numerous bird, which is Antarctic prion. And this is a group of small petrels that are actually very similar to one another. There's some really big identification problems in terms of trying to keep track of them. But Antarctic petrel is the most common. And then, of course, what you're hoping to see are albatrosses. And I had actually never seen an albatross before, despite growing up in Arizona and having the opportunity to go on pelagic trips off of California over the years. But here's a gray-headed albatross out over the southern oceans. This is a black-browed albatross. This is another gray-headed albatross a little closer to the boat. Light-mantled albatross. And then, of course, the king of the albatrosses, which is snowy or wandering albatross. And this is an interesting thing that many of you may be aware of, which is that in recent years, what they've realized with these incredible albatrosses is that they have very strong homing capabilities. And so they breed across what's been called wandering albatross, breeds across the Antarctic region and on different islands. And these islands actually end up having genetically distinct populations that are now being split up into multiple species. So there may be as many as 7 species of what was once considered wandering albatross. And a lot of those birds overlap on the southern oceans, but then they go back to breed back on these islands that they come from. And it's not common to see them on the water, but we did see a few like this. And so they're just an absolutely a spectacular bird with a 12-foot wingspan. They're flying for thousands of kilometers at a time, potentially without landing. They can sleep on the wing, and it's just absolutely unbelievable to see these birds out there. And you sail for probably 4.5, 5 days across the Drake Passage, and then the water can be pretty rough. I'll show you some video of this, but suddenly you get down to the Antarctic Peninsula and you get inside where you're sheltered from the waves by islands we're on the west side of the peninsula now. And there are islands further west that are keeping things very calm. And suddenly you're in this incredibly different world filled with ice and snow and icebergs, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And you start seeing things like humpbacked whales, and these are southern fulmars in front of them. And again, it's just an incredibly beautiful place with glaciers coming down to the water, ice filling the bays and things that you're traveling through. And then to get an idea of the scale of this, we were actually down there in a year where very few of the commercial vessels were actually going into the Antarctic because of COVID. They canceled an awful lot of trips this year. But here's a 4-story ship in the distance there in front of one of these glaciers coming down from the Antarctic Peninsula into the ocean here. So, it's just a place that I had never even, as much as I'd imagined, I just wasn't prepared for how truly spectacular it is. And you can start seeing the different colors and ice that is broken off from various glaciers in the region and has been floating for a while. Depending on what's going on, the melt of ice in various areas can turn the water just these dramatic shades of blue. And again, you're down here in what's the Antarctic summer. So you've got almost 24 hours of light. And of course, this is what we're here for. This was an expedition that was put together to go sample penguins at various colonies across this entire region. And the primary researchers you're going to meet in a few minutes, but they were all women. And so we've come all this way for 6 women, female researchers who have various projects that they're working on. And we're there to look for penguins. And these are a few chinstrap penguins that have pulled up on some ice floes. And as you get a little farther south, you start getting some more. There's actually chin straps and 1 or 2 gentoo penguins in this photo. And then you get further south and you suddenly see something like this in the distance. And you can see that the top of this lower hill in the foreground has got some brown areas, and there's some brown areas to the lower left. And you can start seeing a little bit of movement in the horizon. And as you get closer, you start realizing that all those little dots are actually penguins moving back and forth from breeding colonies on the Antarctic Peninsula. And here's this team of women that I was telling you about. So Jane Younger is at the University of Tasmania, and she was a postdoc at the Field Museum, which is why she's the one who came up with the idea of applying to the Pritzker Fund for money to charter the boat that we took. Rachel Herman is a graduate student at Stony Brook working on gentoo penguin expansion up the Antarctic Peninsula. Sushma Reddy is, as I said, is curator of birds at the Bell Museum. Gemma Klukas is a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and a longtime penguin researcher. And then Katie O'Brien is a master's student at the University of Bath in the UK. And she is working on looking at penguin diets across this distribution. So as in the year that we didn't do the trip, 3 of these women, Gemma Klukas, Sushma Reddy, and Jane Younger, worked with graduate students of theirs to publish this paper on Gentoo penguins, recognizing that looking at penguins using genetic data and morphologic data. And what you can see here is green is the Antarctic Peninsula, blue is the Falkland Islands, the pink is the South Georgia, and then the tan is Kerguelen Island, which is on the other side of Antarctica completely. And you can start seeing that what's going on here is that these Gentoo penguins are actually genetically distinct from one another on each of these areas. And they looked at the morphology too, and they recommended that there actually be 4 species of Gentoo penguins recognized across this distribution. But they wanted to get more data because some people were saying that they didn't think these penguins were all that different. But there are some really different aspects of their habitat. So for instance, you go, and you'll see this over the course of the talk, they go from the Antarctic Peninsula, part of Antarctica, even though it extends about 600 or 700 kilometers off the main part of Antarctica, South Georgia, and then you actually cross the polar frontier, which is the cold Antarctic water, to get to the Falkland Islands, which is only about 300 miles off of the coast of South America. And so that's where we're gonna be looking at. Every time we go ashore, we're very concerned about making sure we try not to bring anything on shore that shouldn't be there. That includes actually bacteria. So you're trying to scrape your boots and get everything off. And here we are preparing on some of the islands off the coast of the western tip of the Antarctic Peninsula to get ready to go ashore to look at penguins. And I have to say that as cool as I thought penguins are before I went there, they're much more interesting in person. And this is an Antarctic Gentoo penguin. And, you know, they're fun to watch. They're amazing animals, and they're relatively easy to work with in a lot of different ways. And at the same time, it's just every once in a while you'd be looking around and just realizing what an incredible landscape you were working in. This is Irby Lovett, who is also on the trip. He's a researcher at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And you can see here that the penguins are almost as interested in you as you are in them a lot of the time, which was, again, another thing that was just kind of amazing to experience. And of course, there aren't just penguins around. This is a Weddell seal, and sitting on the ice, you can see a Gentoo in the background. And this Weddell seal basically was around for the entire 3 or 4 hours or so that we were there. And this was about the 30 seconds in the entire time that he actually lifted his head as he just crashed on the ice, not more than a couple meters from us a lot of times. And this is one of the things we were looking for. This is penguin poop. And you can see it's kind of orange. And what that's filled with is krill, which is an Antarctic crustacean that lives in gigantic numbers, and it's the foundation for the entire marine community there. And you start realizing how important this ecosystem, or how simple and complex this ecosystem is at the same time with respect to all these things eating krill. And so researchers that are studying krill are really worried about what things like global warming are going to do to krill populations over time. And that'll have critical effects on lots of these other species like penguins. So again, I've said these Antarctic Gentoo penguins are considered genetic, or have been shown to be genetically distinct. They breed on these rocky spaces. You've seen this one where they were actually on ice floes, or actually on above snowfields in the previous pictures. Now we're on some of the outer islands, and they're actually nesting on these incredible rocky small islands on these outer areas. And you can see our sailboat in the background, and you can also see the boat that we would use to get ashore each time as we were doing our work, our Zodiac. And again, these penguins are just, they're absolutely spectacular to watch. And you're there at the height of the breeding season in early January. And as you'll see as we go across the trip, the penguin chicks will get older as you get further north and the season goes on. And so these are baby chinstrap penguin chicks. And chinstrap penguins are magnificently interesting birds with that narrow white line across their cheek. They're very noisy and they're very attentive parents. And so we were getting blood from the chicks and returning them to their nests. And it was a very easy and not particularly problematic thing to do. And these birds are completely involved in their breeding season. And so they're very focused on what they're doing. And again, throughout this time, you're in these different colonies. And the great thing about this boat is we were able to determine our entire field season ourselves. And this is something that's really interesting with respect to Antarctic research. So some of my colleagues that were on this trip had actually served out or provided their services on some of the larger tour boats as a way to actually get to these remote penguin colonies. And they could only do it for a few hours. But in this case, because we had chartered the whole boat ourselves, we could spend entire days in places getting the information that they needed for their research. Here's another penguin species we were pleased to encounter because it's actually not very common on the peninsula in a lot of places. This is a Delhi penguin, and a Delhi penguin is, along with emperor, the two penguins that are most tied to the major part of the Antarctic continent. And so they're southernmost penguins. But a few Adelis breed in colonies, in mixed colonies with gentoo penguins and chin traps up into the Antarctic Peninsula. And so we found a few in a couple of sites, which were really neat. And they just have one of the most amazing facial patterns I've ever seen. I mean, their eyes are basically in line with their mouth. And they're really cool little birds. Now, as much as penguins were the purpose of the trip, there are lots of other pelagic birds around. The diversity isn't very high, but they're pretty neat. These are Antarctic shags with these growths on their above their bills and these beautiful blue eye rings. I mean, they're really wonderful birds and flying around all the time. And then I wanted to remind you that one of the things that's easy to forget about penguins is that they're truly pelagic species. And so, here's a little video of what it's like in these incredible places where you're the only people around for hundreds of kilometers, and you're just watching these penguins going around and looking for krill in the shallows off one of the colonies. And it's in moments like these where you realize that, these are birds that are literally designed to as one of Shackleton's shipmates called them, birdfish. And they literally are completely, even though they're on land to breed, they're really adapted to the water. And here's a group of gentoos. You often see them in the Antarctic Peninsula around these colonies coming in groups like this. And there's actually a reason for that. This is a leopard seal, and many of the colonies have leopard seals around them, and these are incredible predators that I'll come back to later in the talk, but they are perfectly capable of taking a penguin and completely shaking them till the body comes out and they leave the skin and eat the penguin that they've caught, and they hang around these colonies all the time. And because of that, there's a lot of because there are these penguin colonies, there are a lot of other birds that hang around them. So this is a South Polar skua in it's a Charadriform in the Jaeger family. And this is an incredible family of birds called the sheathbills. There are only two species, and this is snowy sheathbill. And these are scavengers around these colonies. And the sheathbills have they're kind of like a cross between a pigeon and a gull, and they have an amazing range across all the islands in the Antarctic waters, and they basically spend their entire lives hanging around penguin colonies, taking care of cleaning up dead penguins as they find them. And another aspect of this trip was, again, to get data. And one of the things we weren't sure about, but turned out to be something we could readily do, was actually salvage eggs that had been taken by these scavengers. And a lot of times they would just peck a hole in one side to get at the contents, but we were able to salvage the eggshells and bring them back to the museum for future research. So for instance, one of the questions we can look at is, are these 4 Gentoo penguin populations across this area laying different kinds of eggs because they're breeding in different habitats? And so there's a lot of different biology that we're hoping to eventually get into with respect to this. The other thing we did was we wanted to take advantage of the fact that we were there by gathering data like vocalization. So this is Jacob Cooper out with a microphone recording some kelp gulls that were flying over this area in the Antarctic Peninsula. The other thing you realize when you get involved with these people is that this is a community that has to work together. So here's Gemma and Bryce, and what they're doing here is actually changing out the batteries in a permanently fixed camera that's down here, taking pictures every day of the colony in order to gather data for what the daily experiences of these penguins are over the course of seasons. And that becomes really important with respect to how much snow cover there is early in the season when nobody's around, because that'll dictate whether the Gentoo penguins can even start breeding at a particular period of time. Now, the other thing you realize is that there's more and more people going down to the Antarctic, which is an interesting thing. But when I got back to Chicago, this paper appeared, and this is a paper that's documenting the role of black carbon from boats, which include tourists and researchers. And they're suggesting that the black carbon from diesel engines is actually getting on the ice and causing a measurable amount of melting of some of the ice flows, which may be an interesting thing with respect to something like Gentoo penguin, which is, as I intimated before, is slowly moving actually southward along the Antarctic Peninsula. And that may be something that's possible as a result of a combination of things such as climate change, but also potentially something like black carbon. Well, again, I said this trip has 3 parts to it. We're now going to get back into the open ocean. And again, one of the things you realize is these penguins are going oftentimes very far offshore to find krill and forage. And here's a group of chinstrap penguins off the very northern tip, about 30 or 40 kilometers offshore, off the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, as we're heading now for South Georgia. And again, one thing about this sailboat is, I said the food was very good. You're in very tight quarters, so you're forced to get along with everyone, and it's very well organized, and everything is set up to deal with what it's like to be on the open ocean. And I want to just play this little video here to show you what this kitchen is like. And as you're watching it, you'll see Kenneth doing some dishes, but you can see the pressure cooker in the back is on an armature that allows it to sway with the rolling of the boat, and everything else is bolted down and such that it can't fly out as the boat rolls in bad weather. And as you pan across here, here's Bryce, and Bryce is an incredible artist. And you'll see he's actually doing a pen and ink drawing of a Gentoo penguin here, despite the rolling of the boat. And then we'll look out the window and you'll get a chance to see a little bit about what the ocean is like on this particular day as we're crossing the Drake Channel, the Drake Passage. And this is a fairly typical day. And I think on our particular trip, we had actually good weather almost the entire time. And you see that green means that the water has actually come up over the side of the window on this side of the ship. So it can be fairly rough, and I get seasick. So I got seasick a few times and I got better, and every aspect of that was worth it from my perspective. And again, you sail for 5 days across these rough waters with albatrosses and shearwaters and petrels around the boat. And suddenly you wake up in the morning and you've come around the eastern side of South Georgia Island, and you're on the north side, and you're in this protected harbor. But now you're much farther north, and except that you're still south of the polar front, and you're in a completely different place. And again, what we were able to do on this trip was actually stop in lots of different places to visit colonies that the researchers wanted to sample at. And so this is the actual diagram of the boat's movements as we went across the northern part of South Georgia. And what you can see here too is that South Georgia is covered in ice and snow. And this is what it looks like actually. And we'll come back to Shackleton in a second, but I always say that Shackleton landed on the south side of these islands, and all the whaling stations that they were trying to get to were on the north side. So they actually had to cross these mountains and all these glaciers after having sailed in a boat from the Antarctic Peninsula to get to South Georgia. This is one of these whaling stations. It's now actually a museum for tourists. But again, because of the issues with COVID, we were the only people that had been in Grytviken, in which is the name of this station, in a long time. These stations operated up until the 1950s in some cases. And so it's amazing to realize how much human impact there was on this area as the result of whaling and sealing for many, many years. Again, as I said, Grytviken's a museum now, and you can see the leftover vestiges of the whaling industry, but you can also see that there are Antarctic fur seals all over the place in the foreground. And of course, there's a little graveyard here at Grytviken, and that's actually where Ernest Shackleton is buried, famously with his head pointed towards the south. I have to say, though, that I was more fascinated / blown away by the fact that there was a little plaque honoring Felix Oscar Arturso, who was a 34-year-old seaman on a Argentinian sub, and he was tragically shot during the Falklands War in South Georgia. And the idea that there was actually a battle for someplace so remote and so incredibly beautiful is just crazy to me. Of course, we did this trip before there was any idea of what was going to happen in the Ukraine. And of course, again, you can't help but notice human impacts on these areas, and the people that are in charge of them are always very concerned about additional impact. Here's some of the South Georgia flora. Now you know, instead of having the only plants in the Antarctic Peninsula are grasses, now you're getting many more plants, but right there in the middle is a dandelion, which is introduced from probably as long ago as the whaling and sealing industry first got to these areas back in the 1800s. The other thing that humans tend to bring places are rats and mice. And this is a trap at Grytviken for rats and mice. The good news here is that starting in about 2000, they decided to try to eradicate all the rats and mice from the island, and they actually succeeded. And so this was an interesting thing because that's been good for a lot of the animals. And as you'll see now, when you go ashore at Grytviken or anywhere in South Georgia, there are actually so many animals, particularly fur seals, that you actually need to protect yourself from them to some extent because they tend to be territorial and curious, and they're actually they have big jaws and big heads that could take a significant bite out of you. But what you do is you go ashore and you carry a stick that you can actually put out in front of you to ward them off, and you can do this. But this is a typical picture of a shoreline all along South Georgia. So in spite of the fact that historically hundreds of thousands of fur seals were killed by the fur sealing industry, the populations on South Georgia have come back dramatically. And at this time of year, they're produced young, and they're young in every direction. And these are but at the same time, these animals are literally all over the shoreline everywhere. And you can get an idea for what it sounds like and looks like in this video. And here's a king penguin, which I'll come back to, who's come up on shore. And these are just a bunch of fur fur seal pups lining the beaches, and you can hear them in the background. You can see there's a skua sitting there. And then these are king penguins, which I'll come back to in a little while. Now, the other thing about South Georgia is you're far enough north that this is the furthest south a passerine bird gets on a regular, in terms of a breeding bird. And this is South Georgia pipit. And again, the story about South Georgia pipit is that in 2000, it was almost only found off South Georgia on the small islands because of the rats and mice. But once things had been, the rats and mice had been exterminated, they moved back onto the mainland. And it was incredible to see the populations along all the sites that we visited. Another bird that suffered similarly was the endemic South Georgia pintail. So this is a species of duck that is only found on South Georgia, and again, decimated by rats and mice on the mainland for many years until they finally were able to remove them. And you start realizing that you're seeing these endemic species all together. So here's the endemic South Georgia gentoo penguin along with the pintail, and there's a pipit there in the foreground. And the only insects on the island basically are easiest to find around the penguin colonies. Now, there are other groups of animals that are pulling up on shore. These are southern elephant seals, and they're coming up to shed, and they form these big piles of animals just lounging around that you just walk by, and you can see some king penguins in the distance. And every once in a while, a couple of them get mad at each other. These are actually younger animals, but you can see the scars all along their necks. And again, they're probably 15 to 20 feet, 30 feet long, and they're just incredible birds. Well, now I want to come back to that boat that I told you about leaving Stanley Harbor, because this is it. And it was piloted by a guy named Leif Ponset, who sailed by himself to South Georgia. He's a native of the Falklands. And he's the son of the leading conservation biologist, Sally Ponset, in the Falklands. And so we met up with him again in this bay in South Georgia. There was a snowstorm the night before. And he came over for dinner. And when he came over for dinner, he said, you know, a bunch of you guys are ornithologists. He goes, I was sailing across from the Falklands to South Georgia, and this bird landed on my boat, and it was yellow. And he goes, any idea what it could have been? We didn't know. The next morning, as he was leaving the harbor, he came on board, and I happened to be there. And he said, here's the photo I took of it. And my jaw just about hit the table. I'm guessing you guys will recognize this as a prothonotary warbler. And you can see the breeding distribution of prothonotary warbler, the wintering distribution of prothonotary warbler in blue. And then that red arrow points to about the place where Leif was when that prothonotary warbler landed on his boat. So this is a record in eBird now, but I never thought I'd be on a trip where I would say the best bird on the trip was something we didn't even see. But this is an incredible record. And it turns out that there are records of prothonotary warblers on places like the Galapagos from about the same time in January. So, who knows what happened to this bird? Very probably it ended up in the ocean, but it made it a long ways before that happened. So again, when you're in these now more northerly habitats, you start seeing much more plant and material. These are lichens and bryophytes in addition to grasses. So the diversity is going up, and it's just a wonderful place the colonies here now are in much more different areas. They're surrounded by tussock grass. And one of the things we were doing is using drones to census the penguin colonies. And this was something that Gemma Klukas of Cornell was doing. She got the special training to become a drone pilot, and she would fly the drone over. And the picture on the right is actually what this colony in the photo looks like based on tiling together drone images. And there's a lot of data that researchers can use going over these kinds of photos over time to look at changes in these populations. And here's what a typical landing site looks like. Again, you've got some elephant seals on the right-hand side of this photo. You've got some fur seals all along. You've got a few king penguins in the distance. And then you've got this layer of tussock. And in this tussock is likely to be lots of lurking fur seals that you have to be careful of. And then as you get further up on this green hill, if you look in the distance, you can actually see some birds up on the top of that. And that's a Gentoo penguin colony. And so that's what we were trying to get to sample the Gentoo penguins at this particular site. When you get up there, this is what the view looks like. And it's just absolutely spectacular. And if you'll notice on the left-hand side here, this was the only large cruise ship that we actually saw. It was a French vessel that ended up spending about 4 hours or so in the harbor, where the people on the boat got to get off and come see a couple of the penguin colonies. And then they got back and were sailing out to the Antarctic Peninsula. So again, this was just a spectacular place to be able to spend entire days, up to 12 or 13 hours a day, working up to get to these colonies to begin to get the samples for the research that we've got. So now we're running into some additional penguins. This is macaroni penguin. I like to call this the toucan of the penguin family. It's got a spectacular bill and then these great tufts. It's in the genus Eudyptes, and we'll see some more Eudyptes penguins. They tend to nest on these incredible rocky places that are kind of inaccessible. And so this was a very steep slope. The weather was so bad, we didn't even try to go to this colony, even though there are probably several thousand birds here, because it was just too steep. But all these birds are literally going out to forage in the ocean, coming back, and then working their way up these slopes to get back to their breeding sites. And if you look at the far right-hand side of this slide, you'll see some other little white dots. And this is a gray-headed albatross colony. And this was really fun to see because they're just on these really steep slopes. They have 1 to 2 eggs, and they're breeding every couple years. And the breeding biology of these birds are very long-lived. They're just absolutely amazing to get close to 1 or 2 of the nests and see what they look like close up. And in the macaroni penguin colonies, as I said, we're getting further along in the season. We're further north. The penguins are a lot bigger, but just like any other penguin, the macaronis are great parents. And yet at the same time, every once in a while, there's a little territorial dispute between birds that are breeding side by side, and they yell at one another. And this is what they look like. And I'll actually play you a couple of videos here so you can get the idea of the different sounds. So this is actually South Georgia Gentoo penguin. You see the young are very good at shooting their poop off. And then this is what the macaroni penguins sound like. And again, you can see that they're in a very wet, rocky habitat. And I think you can also see that they're not very bothered by you being around them. And that was something that was really kind of amazing is they don't see you as problematic to them carrying on what they're doing. And obviously, if you go birding around here, that's not really the same kind of thing that you see in birds in, say, North America. Well, now let's get to king penguin, which is probably my favorite just because they're just so stately and amazing. And South Georgia is probably has the most king penguins of any place in the world, and they're long-lived birds. They're breeding on these rocky coasts, and they're interacting with the wildlife like this southern elephant seal. And you start realizing what just an amazing existence they have moving around. And then the other thing is that they breed in incredible colonies. So here we are at one of the largest colonies at St. Andrews, and this is what they look like. Those are juveniles in the foreground. I'll get back to that in just a second. But these colonies are big, and when I say big, I mean really big. This is 50,000 pairs of birds along with their young. And what's amazing about this is that it takes 10 months for a king penguin chick to actually reach maturity. So this is what the juveniles look like. So they look like they have a big fur coat on, and that's a good thing because they're actually going to spend an entire austral winter waiting for the adults to occasionally come back and feed them on the shore. And later on, as they get older, they start to molt into adult plumage. And it's amazing how they look like just completely disgruntled juveniles at this point in time. But you can see that the adult feathers are actually pushing the juvenile feathers, which look like fur, off these birds. And again, when you're in a colony of 50,000 birds like this, the idea that adults are actually going back and forth and feeding their young and finding their mates in these massive colonies of birds is just absolutely breathtaking. And here we are actually working on bleeding, getting blood samples from king penguins. And every once in a while you step back and you think, wow, look at the backdrop that this is happening in. These mountains of South Georgia are absolutely beautiful. Now, again, life for all these birds has its real challenges. So this is a king penguin that's come up on shore, and I think you can see that it's got kind of a half circle wound on its chest, and it was almost certainly bit by a leopard seal. And the craziest thing about this photo is the head of the bird on the right, which is a southern giant petrel that was literally trying to peck at this bird the entire time we were watching it. And what happens is when a bird gets a wound like this is it's probably very likely that if it can't protect itself, it's going to be killed by the giant petrels that are actually scavenging around the colonies. And these giant petrels that are scavenging around these colonies are willing to eat almost anything. This is an incredibly old fur seal carcass, and this bird was just going to town on it. And so, it's a very interesting ecosystem. One of the other things I'd like to point out here is that if you look at the genetic data for how old penguins are, they're on the order of 30 to 50 million years old. So this is a very old ecosystem. And the same thing's true about things like giant petrels, sheathbills, and skuas. So this interaction is something that's been happening on the Antarctic, in the Antarctic area for a long period of time. Well, again, because we were able to work around these colonies and we found one or two dead birds, we were able to bring back some skeletal material for the museum and at least one or two skins. And prepping a penguin is not a trivial thing to try to do. All right, so from South Georgia, we set sail and came back to the Falkland Islands. So we've done this circuit. But the Falkland Islands are interesting because they're about 300 kilometers off the coast of Antarctica or off the coast of South America. and they're north of the polar front. And so now you're in another very different habitat that happens to have gentoo penguins. And so we made a point of spending enough time here to get out to one of the sites that has a lot of gentoo penguins, and it's a place called Sea Lion Island. And the Falklands actually has a lot of people, and because of that, it's actually done a lot of damage to the local fauna. There are rats and mice all over the main islands on the Falklands. And so a lot of the endemic birds like the striated caracara only breed on the outlying islands where there aren't as many rats and mice. And so this is again a falcon, a relative of well, it's a caracara, and you know, they get all the way up into the southern U.S., but this is a species that's only found on the Falklands. There are these birds called steamer ducks, some of which are actually have lost the ability to fly, and this is Falkland steamer duck. These are birds that are around the southern tip of South America, but also get out to the Falklands. This is a female kelp goose, another radiation of geese from the tip of South America, but there are 3 species on the Falklands. And then you're starting to see birds that you could probably recognize as being similar to things we have right around here in Chicago, such as this austral thrush, which is a member of the genus Turdus, just like American robin. And again, this is only found on the Falklands. This is white-bridled finch. It's a little South American finch that's in Argentina, but gets out to the Falklands too. I have no idea whether this is a population that's become genetically distinct or not. It'd be an interesting thing to study. This is long-tailed meadowlark. So it's a relative of our meadowlarks across South America. A number of the species have red breasts, and this is a bird that gets out to the Falklands. And then here's a bird that looks similar to birds you might see in the Lincoln Park Zoo. This is a Falkland night heron. And again, black-crowned night heron or Nycticorax night herons have actually gotten to every continent, and they even get to the Falklands. And so the population out here is considered distinct enough to be called a different species. And one of the things about Sea Lion Island was that it's a very pristine place, still, again, small island. It's about 4 kilometers wide by long and 2 kilometers wide. And one of the things that you can do is walk everywhere on the island, which is really spectacular. And we were at a place where we were hoping to see killer whales, and we got there and we had this fur seal come up and look at us on the right-hand side, and then it pulled up next to another fur seal, which we had seen earlier on our walk, that had a little bit of blood on it, on its tail. And we were thinking about that, and suddenly one of the women with us says, "Killer whales." And we watched this pod of 4 killer whales, 2 adults and 2 juveniles, come into the harbor. And it's very clear that they were literally stalking these fur seals, hoping they would come back into the water so that they could attack them. And again, it's just a spectacular thing to get a chance to see so close up in a place like this. So once again, we're now with another population of gentoo penguins, which my colleagues have said should be considered a separate species based on genetics and morphology. And they're breeding in tussock grass here. And we were able to get some fecal samples of them. And now the young are old enough that they're almost ready to start thinking about going into the water. And at this point in time, they're as big as the adults, and it's almost like Keystone Cops to watch them chase the adults around, trying to get the adults to feed them. And this is a point of time where the adults are very close to abandoning them and forcing the young to actually go out into the water on themselves. We're also coming into contact with another genus of penguin. This is the genus Spheniscus, which are these northern penguins that live on the southern tip of South Africa and the southern tip of South America and get up to the Galapagos. And this is Magellanic penguin. And these guys nest in burrows that they build. And here you can see a young Magellanic penguin. And then what you might not have noticed is here's another bird called a blackish Synclodes, which is a member of the Furnariidae or ovenbird family from South America. And these were very common out on the Falklands and at New Island. And they're insectivores, and so they're feeding off the insects that are hanging around the penguin burrows. And then the last bird I'm going to talk about, the last penguin, is this guy right here. And this is a southern rockhopper penguin. And as you can see, it's doing exactly what it should be doing. And this is what they look like. They're in the same genus as those macaroni penguins. They're much smaller, and they're just incredibly punk in terms of their haircuts. And they've got old young now. But this is the amazing thing about where these birds breed on Sea Lion Island. And this is the colony, and my colleagues are getting poop samples around the colony. And it's on a cliff that rises about 200 meters above the ocean. And there's a tiny little crevasse that comes up out of the ocean that these birds are going up and down all the time in order to go out to the ocean to feed their chicks. And so it's just a spectacular sight. The wind was blowing about 40 kilometers an hour the day we were here. There were black-browed albatrosses flying by, and it's just an absolutely magnificent place. And so I'm going to stop there. I want to acknowledge the lots of different people, the governments and the various folks that ran the boat, and folks at Sea Lion Island, the penguins, which were incredible hosts on this trip, and just a spectacular thing to get it to appreciate. My last photo here of this penguin is a bird that is getting ready to go off into the ocean, open ocean. And I guess, to me, it just epitomizes that I hope we as humans recognize that we share the planet with a lot of incredible biodiversity that we need to figure out how to protect, because they're just out there trying to do what they do over the course of their lives and maintain their populations. And it seems like it's up to us to come up with a lot of solutions to help make sure that keeps happening. And I'll stop there and take any questions.
Okay. I definitely feel like a world away right now, especially compared to the 70-degree November day we're having right now. But thank you. Big round of virtual applause here for John. Thank you so much for sharing that incredible adventure with us. So if folks have questions, go ahead and slap them in the chat, and then I will call on you guys, and you can unmute yourself and ask your questions yourselves. But I have one right off the bat here in the chat from Maureen McDonald. Do you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. And what an incredible presentation. You talked several times about taking blood samples from the penguins. Yep. How do you actually get your hands on them to do that?
You literally walk over and pick them up. and I'm not joking. You're basically picking them up and controlling their flippers so they can't hurt themselves. And once you do that, the way we were taking blood is you can either take it from the feet, which is the preferred way that the researchers do it. It became interesting because king penguins, which are much larger, obviously, have black feet, so you can't see the veins in the feet, and so they had to do draw the blood from the flippers from the wings on the king penguins. But these guys were really skilled. They've done it lots of different times and lots of different places, and so it was really fun to hold the occasional penguin and help them do that.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Well, I have a question kind of while we're waiting for some folks to chime in. I mean, how did you end up coordinating with all these other researchers who had different work or questions regarding penguins? Is there like a penguin Facebook group or something where you're like, oh, hey, we all want to do this, let's go for it? How were you connected with these researchers? How did it all work out? Were you able to all get on this boat at the same time and make this happen?
Yeah, so it actually took 2 years to put together. We had to get the money, and so we wrote a proposal to the Pritzker Fund, which was funded, and then the network of penguin people work together actually and communicate pretty extensively, because they need to have those kinds of networks to even have the opportunity to, for instance, to work on samples from different parts of the Antarctic region. And it's so hard to get down there and so expensive to get down there that I think it's led to people working together more. And, so once we had the money to charter the boat, we didn't have a whole lot of trouble finding interested penguin people to go on the trip. And that was a really spectacular thing. And it's been really fun to watch some of the data that they're beginning to gather come out. So for instance, on the Gentoo penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula, based on the work that the graduate student from Stony Brook is doing, Rachel Herman, is showing that there's actually, well, wouldn't say it's population structure. There are actually genetically different groups of penguins on the Antarctic Peninsula too. And I'd love to know what that tells us. What she's working on is getting more data to figure out what that tells us about the kind of the history of colonization. So the thought process with Gentoo penguins is they actually probably originated on South Georgia and have actually gradually moved south onto the Antarctic Peninsula as they've been able to. And at the same time, it's clear that there's some genetic distinctiveness in some of these populations where I don't think anybody expected that. Yeah, so what are the different types of samples? So, hi, Victor. Good to hear from you.
Hi, Dan.
Yeah, so we got blood samples, we got fecal samples from throughout the region for the penguins. We picked up penguin eggs from a number of different places. And we also salvaged dead penguins for skeletal material for the collection. And so those were the primary samples that we got. But we also, we recorded birds, and those recordings have been submitted to Cornell, to the Lab of Ornithology's the Macaulay Library collection. We posted the photos online, which is, again, that's an interesting thing because, for instance, trying to identify these seabirds, and the example like the snowy albatross is really interesting, where albatrosses have they don't reach maturity until they're probably 7 or 8 years old, and they go through a whole bunch of plumages. And if there are populations from different islands that are actually genetically distinct, they may have different plumages. And so taking photos and maintaining a growing archive of those photos is going to help people figure out what the distributions are of those different populations of albatrosses as they go out onto the ocean in the non-breeding season. Was the sailboat an option to be environmentally correct or to get close to the animals? Good question, Fran. So the quick answer is sort of both. And at the same time, you can't do it completely by sailing. So you're using the engines too. And, I think this is an interesting challenge for people in the future to try to come up with ways to make less of an impact. But certainly the sailboat does reduce the need to use the engines in a lot of different situations, but not all of them. And then what was the smell like in these colonies? My wife accuses me of not being able to smell very well. And what I would say is it doesn't smell very good. And I got used to it very fast and it never bothered me. And but they definitely smell. And of course, the ground is literally covered with penguin guano. That's what you're walking on the entire time you're working in these penguin colonies. When the guy was washing dishes, was he using seawater? What was the freshwater supply like on the ship for the trip that long? So the design of these ships are really amazing. And we were actually washing dishes with a mixture of salt and freshwater. But we had, you have to bring all your fresh water, and they're able to do that. So they have these incredible, every nook and cranny of that boat has been thought about in the engineering of it. And it's specially designed. The hull is designed to withstand some elements of coming into contact with ice and things. I mean, it wouldn't be a good thing to have it floating in the ice. And actually, that was one of the things that happened on this trip. We wanted to go further south to get to a Gen 2 penguin that's a colony that's the southernmost one in the world right now. And the Antarctic ice hadn't broken up yet. And so we couldn't go there, and we had to alter the trip as a result of that. So the researchers know how the penguins find each other in those huge colonies? What sense or senses do they rely on to do that? That's a great question. And I would say it's probably an aspect of sight, smell. But I don't know that they fully understand it. And that's a really great question. They do vocalize, so I didn't get a chance to play it, but king penguin, for instance, the juveniles have this beautiful whistle that they're using, but to my ear, they all sound the same. And so you wouldn't be able to identify your chick that way necessarily. Yeah, I think those are really interesting questions. And yet all these different penguin species are doing this in these gigantic colonies. And you'll see them walking around, and, I get the sense that they can identify neighbors too. And again, with the king penguins, I don't know how that works, because there's got to be so much coming and going. And over the course of 10 months, some of which is going through periods of time where it's largely dark, during the Antarctic winter, you're coming to shore in situations where I don't know how you've got to be using every cue you can in order to relocate your chick or your mate on land in those situations.
We had another question from a little further up from Kathy Garnis. Maybe other than the prothonotary warbler, what was the thing that's biggest surprise on the trip?
So one of the things about this trip is, you noticed I showed you an awful lot of photos, and you can't show everything. We had some things like we had a long-tailed jaeger, an immature long-tailed jaeger, and this is a species that breeds up in the Arctic, and then they migrate down and spend the winter in as far down as the Antarctic. But some individuals actually hang around for the entire summer, and presumably those birds come into breeding plumage and become adults and migrate back north eventually, but they'll spend essentially a whole season down in the Antarctic. The other bird that surprised me, and I'm still trying to get my mind around it, was snowy sheathbill, because snowy sheathbills are supposed to breed on the Antarctic Peninsula and on the Antarctic continent, and then in the non-breeding season migrate to places like South Georgia and the Falklands. But when we got to the Falklands, it was the austral summer, and there were we saw probably 20, 25 sheathbills at one site. And it's hard for me to believe that sheathbills won't be breeding in the Falklands in the near future. And the amazing thing about that is, this is a bird that when it's flying around doesn't look like it flies particularly well. And yet at the same time, it's well documented that they migrate, most of the populations migrate from the Antarctic Peninsula up onto these islands. And so, yeah, that was one of the coolest things for me, was trying to think about what about the natural history of these birds is actually changing as the result potentially of changing climate, and what that implies.
Okay, last call for questions. I don't see any others in the chat. I think we covered them all. So I think without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up here. John, once again, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and just spending the evening with us here. And thank you to all of you who joined us today to spend your evening with us. Really, really appreciate it. As mentioned, this program was recorded. So if you've got maybe a friend or somebody who couldn't attend tonight, they'll be able to view it at some point later this week when I get it up online. Once again, thank you all so much for being here. Definitely check out chicagobirder.org if you haven't already for our next programs, which are already scheduled, as well as also considering becoming a member if you're not already, because it supports awesome programs like the one you attended here today. But with that said, enjoy the rest of your evening here, guys. Have a good one, and break out those winter coats.
Thanks, Edward.